I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
It has been a month since we've been in this material. When I updated the website tonight, it said February the 7th was the last time we had Wednesday class. Today is March the 6th. So that's been a month. Between vacation, sickness, and weather, we had 3 in a row that kept us away. But we're on page 29 this evening in our books, and we're still in Psalm 22. Remember, the psalm started, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And we discussed a couple weeks ago that did not mean that God abandoned Jesus on the cross. But that was the opening line of the psalm that was meant to point the chief priests to the psalm itself, especially the punchline of that psalm, when the faithful cry out, God hears. And God heard the prayer, the cries of Jesus, and he delivered him. He delivered him from death. Not only was the crucifixion not prolonged more than necessary, but of course we have the resurrection of Jesus as well. We're going to come down to verses 16 to 18. And I'd like us to read these 3 verses and discuss, remember, that's the context. And I did forget that we've already discussed about Christ being reproached of men. He trusted in the Lord. Let him have you. Yeah, let him, let me see that again. They trusted in you. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted and you delivered them. They cried out to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men, despise the people. All those who ridicule me, they shout out with the lip and shake their head, saying, He trusts in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. And we talked about how the Pharisees, that was the mock of the Pharisees towards Jesus. So now we come down to verses 16 to 18. Naomi, why don't you just read those in Psalm 22?
For dogs encompass me, company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Okay. Now, there are several elements that appear in this portion of the 22nd Psalm. So what do we have here? What's being described if you were to describe the scene? Like, how would you break it down?
The attitude of people.
All right, it is, but I'm saying if you were just to describe the scene without getting into the meaning of it.
If we were looking at it before the crucifixion, not knowing it was coming, or
after.
after.
Yeah, as if we didn't know it was coming.
Yeah,
We're going to apply it to the crucifixion, but
okay. It's like a bunch of people, or somebody's being picked on.
okay. If you were to take dogs literally, you would think of a pack of dogs, and we're talking about wild dogs here, not little pets. Wild dogs, and they surround you. What's going to happen? What are they doing? They're going to attack you. That's what they've done. And so if we're talking about literal dogs, they have surrounded me. Well, the writer here, David here, says, the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. So how would you think the person writing this is feeling right now? Trapped. Like, as far as that would be something that you sort of think about. Okay, he's saying I'm trapped. He's surrounded on all sides. And what have they done to him in verse 16?
They've already wounded him.
They've wounded him. How? According to verse 16.
Pierced his hands and feet.
All right, so they pierced his hands and his feet. So in other words, they've stabbed him with something. Or like as far as either he has been bitten, like as far as so you pierce the hand that way, or something sharp has broken the skin, and of course that would mean that he is bleeding. You can't pierce your skin without producing some blood. Just even if you cut your finger on a piece of paper, you draw blood. And so they pierced my hands and my feet. What's verse 17 says? What does that say about him?
Count all his bones.
He can count all his bones. What do you suppose he's talking about here? And count all my bones.
You're not broken. Mine says all my bones are on display. Which is
Yeah, that's typically what you would be saying right there. Like as far as we would talk about not a bone in his body is broken, but that's actually someplace else. If you think about counting your bones, well, take a look at your arm. You got skin and muscle on your arm. You can go a little in, you can touch it, and you can feel some of the bones. But really, if you can start counting your bones, your flesh has been really wounded. And like as far as you usually can't see your bones. I've heard of people who've broken their legs and they say, I've seen my bones on my leg. I'm like, that's not a good thing for you to see. We can, on skeletons that they put up in science class, you can take a look at all the bones that we have. You can count your bones. Well, so that's pretty gruesome. That he can say, I can count all my bones. That's hyperbole. It's not saying he has no skin, but he's saying it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. What else in verse 17?
People are staring at him.
All right, and how would that make someone feel? They're looking and staring.
not just staring, but gloating. My life
Yeah.
gloating over. So like with they're happy. People are happy that
Yeah.
he's suffering so much. Or
That's quite the picture too. Like as far as we get starting to feel uncomfortable when people stare at us. We usually when someone's staring at you, or what have I done? What's wrong? But we have this picture. He's been surrounded by evil people. He's been surrounded by what is described as dogs. His hands and his feet have been pierced, so he's bleeding. He's in obvious pain. There have been some damage to his body. He can count his bones, and then there are people, they're all around, they're staring, they're gloating, they're happy about it. No one's helping him. That's quite the scene. Usually we think, okay, someone in the crowd, maybe not everyone, but someone in the crowd would help him. No, the psalmist says, no, that's not it. And now we come to verse 18.
he's naked too.
Why? You're right. But why can you come to that conclusion? It doesn't say I'm naked.
Well, it
But
sounds like they've taken his clothes away from him, and they're divvying up the spoils.
yeah, they have divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Well, so whatever he was wearing, they have come along and they said, there must be some value in what he's wearing. Some clothing we don't reuse, but we send pants if they're not well worn and have holes in them. Sometimes we might send them off to charity and goodwill. Sometimes we send them to people who want them. Like as far as shirts, the same way. We do so with shoes sometimes. Like there's certain amount of clothing, coats, hats, gloves.
But you're talking about clothes that you voluntarily give.
You know what I'm talking about? Well, yeah, I was going to bring it back to this.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I'm saying we reuse clothes, so those we see those as valuable. Now these people here, they're stealing his clothes. They find them valuable too, and that my point was that we find value in certain things, and so things we find value in, thieves will steal. We'll get to what they found valuable about Jesus' clothing when we get to the Gospels. But they stole his clothes. So now he's sitting there practically naked. Whatever they didn't want, he might be wearing. But they divided my garments. So in other words, there's only so much clothing to go around. And in some cases, depending on what it is, people might tear clothing. They may say, well, I don't want the whole shirt, but we'll take some pieces that we can patch together in other shirts or other pants or other robes. This would be robes at the time. And so they said the material is good because remember, people made their clothes then. We take for granted, we go to the store, we buy clothes. There are very few people who actually make their own clothes today. Whereas the people here, they made their own clothes. So the material was valuable. And so you can rip apart clothing. You can divide it up so that you can reuse the material. Because maybe the clothing won't fit you. But you can make it into something that does. And so they divided it. But there wasn't enough to go around. So what did they do for it?
They cast lots.
They cast lots. Now, we see this in Scripture a lot. What does that mean? What does that usually mean?
It's like gambling.
All right, it is a form of gambling. Sometimes, though, the Lord speaks through lots, because remember, Matthias was picked by Lot. And so it's not always gambling, but in this case it is. They can't, or it's at least a form of it. They can't all have it. So sometimes we say, oh, they were drawing straws. When we draw straws, there's usually only one winner. There's more than one. So usually when lots are drawn, what you do is you'll take like a rock or something, and you'll put a mark on it, and that will be you. And you'll put it into a bag, and you will draw it out. You will draw a lot out. When the children of Israel got their land, and it was determined as to who would get what land, it was done by lot. Now God spoke through that lot. Like as far as that was God speaking through that. But basically the scene you'd have there, Joshua would be describing the land, and they would pick out, okay, this is Ephraim's land, or this is Gad's land, or this is Judah's land. And that's how they did it. Well, if you have 5 pieces of clothing and you have 10 people, everyone would put their rock into the bag and you'd pull it out, and the first 5 were the ones who lots were drawn. And so it can be a form of gambling. It can be a form of gambling. It doesn't have to be a form of gambling, though. And so, but in this case, they were gambling for it. So that's the scene we have. All of these expressions we can go and find application for in the death of Christ. Only the last one, though, is actually cited in the New Testament. Only verse 18 is actually cited in the New Testament. So to help appreciate the significance of the other elements, let's examine them one by one before looking at the actual messianic promise that is declared and fulfilled. So we have these dogs surrounding the psalmist here. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. The reference to dogs is often used in Scripture to describe people who are contrary to God. Tammy, you want to get Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, and Bill, Revelation 22, verse 15. Philippians chapter 3, verse 2.
Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the mutilation.
This is not a sign. Paul's not saying, put up signs, beware of dogs. My dad had a sermon one time, beware of dogs. And everyone was wondering what he was talking about. And he's just pulling it out of Philippians. But beware of evil people, people who are contrary to God. Revelation 22, verse 15.
But outside are dogs and sorcerers, sexually immoral, murderers, and idolaters, and whoever loves and practices a lie.
So outside of what? In Revelation 22.
Outside of heaven,
Yeah.
outside of God's kingdom.
Outside of God's kingdom, outside of heaven. I think that's a fair look at that passage. Outside are dogs, not the animals, but people who are contrary to God. And then John comes out and lists a whole bunch of people who are contrary to God. They might not all be sorcerers or sexually immoral or liars or everything like that, but they're contrary to God. And so Jesus knew all the details and the circumstances that would occur around his death. Let's go to the Gospels now and read about what Jesus foretold about his death. He did so 3 times in the Scripture before he died. First one's in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 21. And we'll get Henry to read it. I would like us to focus on what Jesus foretold about in this passage. So Matthew 16, verse 21.
Then Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him, saying,
No, verse 21, not 22. 21.
From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day.
Okay, so where is Jesus' death going to take place? Jerusalem. And so he's not in Jerusalem. He's in Caesarea Philippi, or at least had been earlier in the chapter. But he's got to go to Jerusalem. He didn't go to Jerusalem that often. In fact, you only read him in Jerusalem before the final week of his life. You only read him in Jerusalem in the book of John. He spends a lot of time in Jerusalem in the book of John until you realize the book of John really only covers about 5 weeks of Jesus' entire ministry. The entire book of John. And the last 8 chapters or 9 chapters of John covers 1 week of Jesus' ministry. And so we think, the Gospels, they cover 3 years. The book of John will cover 3 years in a matter of 6 weeks in different accounts and of different events that happened during Jesus' ministry, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they give a more broad overview of Jesus' ministry. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he doesn't spend a lot of time in Jerusalem. Because in actuality, he didn't. He spent a lot of time in Galilee. But he's saying, I have to go to Jerusalem. All right, who's involved in Jesus' death?
Religious leaders, the elders, scribes, and priests.
When you hear that, would you be shocked if you were hearing that for the first time? Yeah. You'd be shocked if you heard the evil was from the religious leaders. Now maybe today we might not be shocked, because we often find some of the worst scandals have been purposed by those who claim to be religious, which is why a lot in the world scoff at God. They mock religion because they see the absolute hypocrisy of it lived through those hypocrites. Not religion is hypocritical. Maybe I'm sort of tripped over my words just now, but they see the hypocrisy in people, and they say that religion is hypocritical because of the actions of a very vocal set of preachers. There were scandals in the 80s and 90s among evangelical preachers for adultery, theft, fraud. And that put, even though they were teaching false doctrine, it's very hard to teach people the truth when they think those people are teaching the truth, and look at them. And so the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes are the ones who were the ringleaders of this all. What would be the result?
He was going to be killed.
He was going to be killed. Was it going to be the end?
No,
He'd be raised the third day. So that was the first time. Now let's go to do the second time, chapter 17, verse 22. And we'll get Leslie to read that. Matthew 17, verse 22.
When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men.
And get verse 23 as well.
They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life."
Okay, what is different? What is the same? What is the same in Matthew 17 versus what we read in Matthew 16?
Killed and raised.
All right, so killed and raised. What might we say is a little different in the way Jesus phrased it? It's not different, but
Hands of men.
okay. So he's not as specific here. It is the hands of men. And so in this, Jesus could also be telling us that there's more than just the scribes, the chief priests, and the rulers. There's more. And of course, we know there were more. But the result is the same. They will kill him. The expectation is the same. He will be raised. Now let's go to Matthew 20. We'll come up to Naomi. Matthew 20. I want to see if it's just verse 18. I want verses 18 and 19.
"See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day."
What piece of information do we get that is new? There's a couple that are very specific.
Handed over to the Gentiles.
All right. So we finally get the Gentiles identified. Now we have the scribes, the chief priests, mentioned again. So we have that. So he's handed over to the Gentiles. What other piece of information did we get?
Mocked, flogged, and crucified.
This is the first time we have learned he was going to be crucified. That's the first time we've learned he was going to be crucified in the three sayings. We were just told he was going to die at the hands of men. What was the most typical of the way to execute someone under Jewish law? Stoning. And so if you'd expect if it was just the Jews that he would be stoned. That's what happened to Stephen. He wasn't crucified, he was stoned because he wasn't handed over to the Romans. But here we're finding out he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. To be scourged, to be mocked, to be crucified. There is one more piece of information in verse 18 that we missed that is different. It's one word.
The one who hands him over to the chief priests.
So who did that?
Judas.
That was Judas. So he was betrayed into the hands of men. This is the first time we saw that Christ was not going to be arrested in front of the people. No, it's one of his own that is going to betray him into the hands of men. So those are three things. Jesus has gone from more specific, this is the most specific, because we're a week out now. By the time we're maybe 10 days out. By the time you get to Matthew 20, he's on the road to Jerusalem from Jericho, and so he's very specific here. And he is going to that. Do you have something, Tammy? Or?
I was just going to say that he mentioned about being betrayed in Matthew 17 too.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I missed that off there. I apologize if I did. But it's very clear when he's saying he's going to be betrayed into the hands of men. I have to go back and re-note that. But, what was that?
I was saying the scene that we read in Psalms is becoming more clear now. Like
Yeah.
the one where he saw his bones. I was thinking, the Lord wasn't a healthy looking specimen when he was at Calvary.
No.
He had been beaten, probably hadn't eaten.
Yeah. Been up all night.
Physically,
Yeah.
he's in pretty bad shape.
Yeah. He's surrounded. Like as far as you think about the cross itself, people are down there mocking him. They're all looking up at him. They see the damage that's inflicted. Like you think about his hands and his feet. Now, of course, it's his wrists that are here, but that's hands. We often will say, "Oh, this is my hand right here." We'll include our wrist in our hand. You're not crucified through your palm. You won't hold up on the cross through that. They will take almost a railroad spike and hammer that through your wrist. And they'll do it through both wrists and through both ankles. Same thing with your feet, that you don't have enough bones. Like if you just take the skin off your hand, you'd find all those little bones that are there that make up your hand. Your wrists and your ankles are a little bit more strong. But that's what they would attach to the cross. And so, yeah, we get this whole scene. Dogs being described, and so these are the people who are contrary to God. They're the people we wouldn't expect. The chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. And then there are people we would expect. The Gentiles. But they're all there. And so all of that, they pierced my hands and my feet, is a reference to the crucifixion. And my Uncle Brian said here, according to a variety of Bible encyclopedias and dictionaries, crucifixion dated all the way back to the Egyptians and has found its way into history with the various nations between the Egyptians and Romans. The Romans were the ones who mass-produced it. Like as far as they were the ones who were generally known for it. That is the thing. And when you think about the purpose of crucifixion, besides killing someone, why did the Romans do that? Why didn't they just stone them or do something like that?
It was a detriment, like it's public humiliation, slow, agonizing, torturous death, and people could see that and go, "I'm not going to do what you did."
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's exactly what Psalms 22 is getting at. He's put on public spectacle. People are going to look and they're going to mock him, and they're going to take a look at him, and it's just scorn and ridicule. It's a public spectacle. And you could go throughout places and you would just see the crosses where they executed people. And people could watch. They could watch someone in agony if they wanted to.
That's why they do public hangings in Iran, too.
Yeah.
Same kind of reason.
Same thing. And they used to do it with the guillotine. In Europe, they would have public execution. It was a means of deterrent, or at least of, all right, this is what's going to happen to you if you do this. And so, what we get here, though, the actual fulfillment of the only part that is mentioned in Scripture is in Matthew chapter 27, at verse 35. So, I think we're to Tammy. Verse 35 of Matthew 27.
Then they crucified him and divided his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Okay. So I want to get the other passages in Mark 15, because I think it's mentioned there too, because I want to get what what it said as far as what clothing he had. So it may not be there. Anyway, what Jesus would have, what most people would have, and remember this is late March, early April. So it's not hot yet.
1524.
1524, did I miss it? I'm trying to pass. Oh, there it is. That one had it. That one had it as mentioned there, but it didn't have what clothing he had.
I mean, the one where they say because it was one piece.
Yes.
Maybe Luke.
Yeah, I'm looking for it. If we can find, if you can find it, we'll find it. But anyway, they had. You would have a cloak. You would have whenever you read of garments, there would be inner garments and outer garments. Right now it's cold outside. We all wear coats. But we have inner clothing too. Which is more valuable usually?
The passage you were looking for is John 19.
John 19.
23.
John 19:23. You want to read it? That way you can get in.
Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took
Go ahead.
his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece.
Okay, and that's what they were casting lots for. Because they couldn't divide it.
And it even brings up the scripture about.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the next verse.
Yeah, in the next verse. Yeah, no, that's exactly what they were doing. But which is usually more valuable, inner clothing or outer clothing? Coat?
Outer, well,
Yeah.
that's what people see.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that, but usually coats are made of warmer material. They will be thicker, and they're probably made of a lot more valuable material. We're not talking about robes that are meant for show. Jesus didn't have one of those. He had an outer tunic. Remember, this is March, April. It is still not 90 degrees outside. It would still be cool, especially at night. And so you would wear a coat or a tunic. And that was one piece. You didn't want to rip that. Because that was much too valuable. That's what they cast lots for. Because whoever had that, they won. They got the most valuable piece of what Jesus had. And it was said that this was done that to fulfill that which was spoken by the prophets. The Roman soldiers didn't know they were doing that. But God did. God knew what was going to happen. God didn't cause it to happen. But again, God knows the hearts of man. God can say what the future is because he knows what the hearts of man is. He doesn't cause the future. We have complete free will over our choices. But when God prophesies something, it will be so. And the psalmist was, since this psalm is entirely messianic, was describing a situation that you might say, well, that didn't talk about crucifixion. But when you compare it to the crucifixion, it most certainly was. Even if the psalmist didn't know that it was. Because what he was describing was exactly what Jesus went through, even down to the detail that they cast lots for his clothing.
I imagine it was probably given to him by a woman who was supporting him.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's a pretty assumption. Someone gave it to him that was looking out for him. Whether it was, you have his mother there as well.
True.
And so you never know who gave it to him.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the most valuable thing he had. It was that coat. And they cast lots for it. So we can see the fulfillment of God's plan all the way through. And you might say, well, this seems rather insignificant. If Scripture spoke of it, it's significant. And it shows God's control over this universe, even though he gives us free will.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor